Well, welcome everyone to our third Ask Me Anything session from the UQ AI Collaboratory. My name is Caitlin Curtis. I'm from the Center for Policy Futures and the School of Business. And I will be moderating our discussion and asking the experts the questions that you've submitted. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land where we're meeting today. I'm here in Brisbane, the Yagara and Turrbal people, and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and recognize this long, continuous connection to country. So this afternoon's topic is misinformation and AI. This is your opportunity to ask any burning questions you have about AI. That can be from the technical side all the way to the legal, ethical, social implications of misinformation. The Ask Me Anything series is brought to you by the UQ AI Collaboratory, and you can learn more about the UQ AI Collaboratory at the website here. The idea of these events is to raise awareness about UQ AI research and all the great research in this area going on here at UQ, and bring together as well different perspectives on the research. This way we can create new connections and collaborations within the UQ community, and we'll be continuing these Ask Me Anything sessions throughout this year. And you can go to the UQ AI Collaboratory website to find out about the other fantastic events from the UQ AI Collaboratory. And please also, if you have topics for future Ask Me Anything sessions, feel free to let us know. We would love to hear what you would be interested to ask questions about. So the way today will work, you can see here on this slide, we will, today's session is 60 minutes, and then we'll have pizza for people in the room. We will start off with introductions and a video, and start off with those questions that you submitted when you registered. And then we will have an opportunity for those of you on Zoom or in the room to ask questions live in sort of the last 20 or so minutes. And then we'll have the pizza, as I said. So if you have questions as you go along, just feel free to jot those down if you're in the room, or feel free to pop those into the chat box, and we'll get to them in the later part of the session. So to get us started, I would like to introduce the panel. We have two amazing experts. I won't be able to do their bios justice, but please feel free to have a read of their bios in the Ask Me Anything page. First of all, on my left, Professor Catherine Gelber is the head of School of Political Science and International Studies, POLSIS, and she's a professor of politics and public policy. Her research is in the field of freedom of speech and the regulation of public discourse. She is a fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences Australia, and she has published an enormous amount of peer-reviewed research and books. And she was invited by the United Nations to be an Australian expert witness at a meeting about free speech, racial hatred, and international law. It's just a real honor for you to be here and to lend your expertise. Thank you very much. And on my right is Dr. Gianluca Di Martini, and he's an associate professor in data science here at UQ. And among his varied research interests, one of them is understanding how people interact with misinformation on social media and using AI to mitigate its spread online, and we'll definitely be asking more about that. His research is currently funded by the Australian Research Council, Facebook, and Google. He also has published an enormous amount of peer-reviewed scientific publications and is a TEDx speaker, and we're really lucky to have you here. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So to start things off, I think we have a question, which is the perfect way to start, from Chen. What is misinformation? I think that's starting with the basics. I don't know who's like to go first. I might ask you that.
Sure. So there's misinformation and then there's disinformation. And even though it's only one letter different, it's really important. So misinformation is just wrong information online. That in and of itself is absolutely not a new problem. The scale at which that problem manifests is, of course, different in the digital age. We have more and more people getting their information from online sources that are not necessarily credible, you know, the feeds they read on Facebook or on Twitter, for example. And that in and of itself makes misinformation not a new problem, but a problem at scale. And then we have disinformation. Disinformation is the deliberate use of false information in order to cause harm. And it could cause harm to individuals, spreading lies and rumours about somebody. It could cause harm to individuals, or it could cause harm to the very institutions of democracy itself. So what we're seeing is troll farms and misinformation farms and disinformation farms that are actually dedicated to undermining some of the core institutions in democratic countries, and a really excellent example of that is elections. Having public trust in the legitimacy and fairness of elections is an essential core democratic trait. And when millions of people start to lose trust in what is on the evidence a fair and equal electoral process, then you really start to get into dangerous territory. And so disinformation can be really dangerous for democracy itself.
Excellent. Do you have anything to do?
Yeah, just to add to that, so that's the perfect definition of the two relevant concepts. What I find most interesting of the definition is really breaking down what it means to be false or misleading, right? It's something then, as myself from a technology point of view, we need to implement in a way, and it becomes tricky because in most of the cases, it's not really a binary, this is true and this is false, which would make it very easy to code and implement into an algorithm, but it's not. It's on a continuous scale, and even it's multidimensional. You have many aspects of what something being misleading means, and it may be misleading for someone and not for someone else, or on a specific aspect of it. So it's a very simple definition, but a very complex thing to model within computers and artificial intelligence.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, and the complexity of what misinformation is, and we'll probably get to it as we answer questions, but actually thinking now about verbal or written or even image misinformation. And I guess this one's just coming from me, just to follow up and clarify. Can you explain a bit about how AI and algorithms can help spread misinformation? And we'll get to how they can help identify it, and got some questions there, but I just wonder how the role of AI or algorithms or technology more generally into spreading them.
Yeah, absolutely. Technology and AI can be used to spread misinformation online, and it is being used to spread it. There is a number of ways we can use AI in a harmful way to spread misinformation. I think first of all, we can use it to create misinformation. We have generative models that can create content which doesn't exist. And AI is very good to do things at scale. So we can create a lot of misleading content automatically. And content can be text, can be images, can be videos that are misinformation fundamentally. So AI can be used for that. And the other way technology can be used to spread is it's not just in the creation, but really it's in the diffusion of misinformation in a social network. Because it is a network, a bit like a virus, network science has studied how things propagate in a network, so we can in a way leverage this knowledge to make misinformation spread better through influencers, for example, through specific actors and elements of the network that are reaching a vast audience. Those are ways in which we can use algorithms to spread faster and better misinformation.
There are two other factors I think that absolutely speak to why that it's been so prolific in the digital age. The first is the psychology of it. So we know that the way in which social media in particular works, the very fast dopamine hits, the potential for lots of dopamine hits in a short period of time. It's a very kind of addictive type of activity. And so in that way, the combination of AI and just how the digital era works in and of itself is kind of, it changes how human beings interact with each other, potentially not in very helpful ways, and is quite addictive. And the other one is that the entire business model of the social media platforms and indeed the internet is clicks. And you get more clicks, the more upset people are. So it's actually kind of built into the entire way that that online interaction works, is the desire on the part of the people who draft the algorithms and who run the code that actually determines what we see and how we share things. It's built into that we should do that as much as possible and as often as possible and as frequently as possible and as quickly as possible without necessarily verifying the accuracy of the things that we're getting enraged about. And we have, you know, obviously deliberate provocateurs as well who say things simply for the purpose of other people reacting and then passing it on and then sharing it and sharing it. So we have this kind of structural and also psychological reasons why misinformation is so easily shared.
Now, we have a question from Shinyu. How can we track information and deal with it? And we have a kind of a related one. I'll just throw them in together. How can we, from Tree, how can we detect misinformation? Detecting, identifying.
Yeah, I think staying at the general level of information propagation, there has been a lot of studies looking at how information propagates in social media and tracking it, right? How there has been studies, for example, how people share news and then how news is getting propagated in a social network and how it changes through propagation. For example, people say something different of a quote that the politician originally stated in the speech. This somehow slightly gets modified through the different times it gets shared. So in a similar way, we can study how misinformation propagates through a network. We can track it, and then we can understand how it happens. And that's very useful to then design approaches to mitigate the effect of this propagation.
Yeah, thank you. And I guess it's kind of my understanding, my own question, is that how on the social media platforms, it's my understanding that there's sort of a combination of automated, potentially AI sort of tracking and identifying, as well as human moderation of this sort of information. Is that
correct? So it's a mix of algorithms and humans who moderate content, which basically means decide whether some content is not appropriate to be on the platform. And this is according to a set of guidelines defined by the platform, what is acceptable and what is not. And you really need both algorithms and people to do this job, because the sheer amount of data is unmanageable by people alone. So you need algorithm to do sort of filtering or selection of content to be moderated. But then you also need humans to really make a judgment, final call whether something fits the guidelines or not, because algorithms cannot do it. And we have seen even humans cannot do it sometimes. They make mistakes, and then there is repercussion and effects of these mistakes. So really you need a combination of both. Because as we said at the beginning, it's a very difficult call to make whether something matches or doesn't match what's allowed. And it's not just black or white.
So yeah, those guidelines are publicly available, right? You can go onto Twitter and you can go onto Facebook, for example, and you can look at their community standards and you can read them. One of the other kind of difficulties, you're absolutely right, human beings make mistakes, the algorithms get things wrong, human beings make mistakes. But one of the other difficulties with effective moderation is that because these industry or these businesses are global in nature, they have a set of standards that they try and apply universally across the world. So the definition that they would use of hate speech in Australia is the same definition that they would use in any other country. And that makes it really hard for them to get it right, because often really understanding when speech crosses the line into being harmful and therefore it should be moderated requires contextual local knowledge. And so obviously they have moderators in different countries around the world, and in an attempt to do that, I'm not saying they don't attempt to do that at all, but these things are intention. Their attempts to incorporate local knowledge and their desire for universally applicable content moderation rules that will apply to their entire business. They're in a very significant degree of tension, and that also contributes to them not always getting the moderation right. And to be fair, I think that it would be hard to always get that moderation right. It is, as Gianluca has said, it's often difficult to determine whether something crosses the line. And with misinformation, it's even harder, because with something like hate speech, you can get a definition of hate speech, or with, you know, they talk about dehumanisation, for example. There are some clear examples of when something would cross the line into hate speech, although I'm not saying they get that right all the time either, because they don't. But with misinformation, it's even harder, because you can't just take something off social media because you allege it to be not true. We know that disinformation around the last US presidential election has been very, very, very harmful to democratic institutions. But there's a whole continuum, as Gianluca said, and determining at what point something is sufficiently harmful to be removed is almost impossible.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, and it's also really having an impact on the people that are doing that job as well.
Yes, that's right. There's a lot of accounts of that, unfortunately. Again, the platforms say that they provide appropriate support to their staff and so on, but there have been plenty of articles showing that, or arguing that people in these positions are really, you know, I can't imagine how distressing it would be just to be confronted with the volume of, they only see the stuff that's either thrown up by AI or that individual users of the platforms have complained about. So they're seeing the worst of the content day in, day out. I can't imagine how difficult that would be.
So following on from that, sort of the technical side, a question from Shazia: how can crowdsourcing help identify misinformation?
That's definitely one approach that we have to detect misinformation. And it allows us to deal with this sheer amount of data challenge that we have. It's just so much that the classic approach doesn't work. The classic approach is having journalists, fact checkers, who have studied years and years, and they follow forensic processes to find the sources and the evidence, and then debunk the claims made by someone, which could take a week to a team of journalists for one claim.
Yeah.
So that doesn't really scale, right? It's extremely accurate, it's very useful, but it's hard to scale. So crowdsourcing could be one way, together with AI, to scale the fight against misinformation. There is currently a very interesting project at Twitter, which is called Birdwatch, which is exactly crowdsourcing fact-checking. So basically, selected users of Twitter can select tweets and then they fact check them. But it's not only one person fact checking them, it's a group of users, and then they may agree or disagree. Each of them provides their own evidence in favor or against a tweet being misleading. And then the system, the platform, puts all these labels together, and it's using these labels to notify users reading these tweets and warning them that this tweet may be misleading. Some evidence. So that's an example of crowdsourcing to address the misinformation challenge.
It's really interesting. Does that
We have studied it recently. I think the project only started a year ago. We've been collecting data about these labels generated by the crowd and compared them with fact checkers. And well, in summary, it works. If you put, it's the wisdom of the crowd. If you put all these people together, they are as good as the journalists. Maybe the individual member of the crowd may be wrong. When you put a lot of them fact-checking one tweet, they get it right. They get the same conclusion as the fact-checkers did. And they can be faster than the fact-checkers because as soon as the tweet is out, they are on it. Someone is on it, and they can be faster and as accurate as the fact-checkers, which is good news.
That is good news. Really interesting. Just have a follow-up question again. What's the incentive for the people to be involved in the crowdsource checking?
In the Twitter example is simply helping others. It's a bit like in Wikipedia. They don't really get paid, or they don't get a job at the end. It's really this sense of purpose and community belonging, of helping others in not being misled by what's happening, what's being shown to them on social media.
Okay, we've got one more along these lines from Bikesh. Is the algorithms alone, we talked a bit, but are the algorithms alone sufficient for detecting misinformation? And what are some specific methodological challenges in identifying misinformation?
Yeah, look, from a technology point of view, we do have the tools to detect misinformation online. But now, what that means is that we give some examples to an AI of this is what misinformation looks like, and the AI is learning, it's looking at patterns in the data and learning something that will tell that something looks like misinformation. And then the AI learns that when the claim is coming from that politician, it's most likely misinformation. What could possibly go wrong? So that's really not acceptable, right? There are mistakes and biases that the AI can learn from the data we present to it, which basically means that it's not enough to fight misinformation by itself. So we really need this coordinated approach where we must use AI, otherwise the scalability is an issue. We must use the experts because they need to make the call on the difficult cases where they need to judge whether it's harmful or not, who is potentially being harmed, whether that claim is misleading. So all those things, we need experts. For the scale of it, we need AI. We need probably the users of the platforms to be literate in deciding whether to trust or not to trust something online, and we need the platforms to be part of it. So it's a coordinated effort.
From a policy perspective as well, it's also really, really important that in designing those responses, that we have the humanities and social sciences disciplines right at the beginning, not tacked on at the end. The reason I say that is, for example, there's a very powerful book written by Safia Noble called Algorithms of Oppression, where she shows how the coders who have drawn up algorithms thinking that they're writing objective code that will do X have unconsciously and unwittingly built into their, at least I hope it's unconscious and unwitting, built into their algorithms the same marginalisations and the same prejudices and the same disadvantages that exist in society as a whole. So algorithms that operate on searches that involve people of colour, for example, or women, will produce particular types of results that are different from the algorithms that operate for other identifiable groups. And so it's really important that as part of that project, because obviously you're right, at scale, we need AI because we can't deal with this problem at the scale that we've got it without the assistance of AI. But right from the very beginning, the way that code is written needs to have the input of people who understand the social impact of AI, people who understand how unconscious prejudices can be written into code without anybody intending that to happen. Otherwise, we're just going to continue to kind of reproduce the problems that we
have. Moving on to the social side, and wondering if there's are we going to be able to manage this problem? Is there any way to regulate misinformation and the tech platforms? Is this a valid solution? Question from James.
So we have to have a multi-pronged approach. We have to have all the things that Gianluca has talked about, but we also need to talk much, much, much more than we do about the responsibilities of every individual user on the platforms. People should not be sending things on and sharing things without checking them, without looking to see if they are, what source they came from originally, whether it's come from more than one source, whether it's just a rumour that's spreading around Facebook, or whether it has some other purpose, whether this has been deliberately released in order to create provocation and to create clicks. Now, I'm not saying we can all spend hours and hours and hours doing that, but at the moment we're at the other end of that spectrum where the majority of users are not spending even a split second's thought. They're going, oh, that's terrible, click, share. And it's just, people need to think much more about it. One of the things, I've been researching free speech for a very, very long time. And one of the things that is so often forgotten in the free speech debate is that free speech, like any human right, carries with it the commensurate responsibility not to infringe on other people's rights when exercising your own, and not to harm others when you're exercising your own human rights. And that really applies to the online sphere. Individual users need to understand that they have a responsibility. And yes, this comes down to every single human being who's got one of these devices and who spends however many hours a day they spend on social media. We all need to think twice before forwarding things. It has to be part of the picture. It's not the whole picture. I'm not saying that individual responsibility is everything. Absolutely not. We operate inside structures that mediate our behaviour and that make certain choices open to us and certain choices closed off and certain choices easier to implement, and of course we're all time poor. I understand all of that. There are structural issues, there are AI issues. There is a role for regulation, government regulation I mean by that. But the government regulation needs to be careful because free speech is such an important right and because it's so easy to overreach. And you have to be really, really careful in this area that in a desire to do good, you don't accidentally do more harm. And so I do believe that regulation has a place, but it needs to be very carefully calibrated and it needs to be narrowly targeted. I actually really like, there's an idea that's come up in the UK. They're currently developing an online safety bill. And in the UK, what they've developed is a notion of a statutory duty of care. And what they mean by that is when somebody builds a bridge, we expect that bridge to operate in such a way after it's been built that the users of that bridge are not harmed by driving on that bridge. So we expect them to build that bridge in a way that people won't accidentally fall off it, or it won't collapse under the weight of a big truck. When we allow people to build online platforms that they profit enormously from, the idea that's being discussed in policy terms in the UK is we should require them to build those platforms in such a way that its users aren't harmed. Now in Australia, we have a completely different approach to that. In Australia, we have the view that we'll just identify these little categories like non-consensual pornography is a category, bullying, online bullying of children is a category that the E-Safety Commissioner is onto. So we have these different categories and we legislate around a particular category and we say, this is how we're going to deal with this problem. This is how we're going to deal with that problem. Whereas I like this idea from the UK, this idea that we say, well, you've built these platforms, you profit from them. You have a duty of care to ensure that the users of your platforms are not being harmed. It'll be interesting to see how that goes.
I have an issue with that because I do agree that we should tell car manufacturers to build in safety belts in their cars so people can use them and be safe. But it's, in my opinion, too easy to tell a social media platform build it so that it's not harmful, because no one knows how to do it. It's really, I don't think it's a question of like it would be for building a car, or we could save some money if we don't put the safety belt in, so we can reduce cost and increase profit. It's not a question of profit. They have the resources to do anything possible. I just think no one knows how to do it. And they do have the resources, probably more than anyone else, to identify a solution. Personally, I don't think there is a lack of desire to solve the problem. I think they would like to solve it because this, again, would increase the trust that their users have in the platforms and increase their addiction and their revenues. So they have an interest in solving it. I think it's just a difficult problem. So therefore, regulation would be good, but may not be enough. You cannot tell platform, if you run it, you need to solve this, because no one knows how to do it.
Some of the, I agree with that. I think there's a new owner of Twitter who might not be very interested in dealing with the harms of his platform.
And we'll get to that one if we have time. I have some questions. So we have a question from Stan related to this. How can we or should we penalize social media platforms for sharing misinformation?
Well, I guess that gets back to what we were just talking about, the difficulty of regulation. So there's the platforms doing their own content moderation. We've recognised that in the area of misinformation, that's particularly difficult. Some things it's easy to say whether they're a lie or misleading, other things it's not. So there's a role for content moderation. There's a role for government regulation at the extreme end, at the end at which it's really clear that a particular type of online behaviour is harmful enough to warrant government intervention. There's a role for the people who write the code and write the AI to become more conscious of the kinds of things that they're building into the systems, so that they can try and ensure that that they're reducing harm as much as possible. There's a role for the individual users. So penalties are probably, penalties would be part of they're part of a regulatory framework in Germany, for example, not in relation to misinformation, but in relation to hate speech. There's a new law which can fine social media companies a lot. I think it's up to 40 million euros if they don't quickly enough take down evidently illegal content, by which they mean hate speech that's prohibited by law in Germany. So there are some penalties, but again, it has to be part of the more complex, multifaceted approach to the problem.
Okay, we've got one from Lee. Are there patterns, and maybe both of you have a response to this, are there patterns of fake news that people tend to believe more than others? I wondered if that might also have a technical component, in terms of the maybe the crowdsourcing or.
Yeah. Okay. I'll give you my incomplete answer to the question. So I think what we have seen in the literature I follow is that. So we would expect that what is the statement in this misinformation is the reason why we believe to it or not. But in reality, it seems that it's much more the context around the statement that makes us believe in something or not. So it's really about who has said something and where we see it. So the same statement, if it's being told by us by the mate I play soccer with on the weekend versus the multi-billionaire who has interest in big pharma, and we know why he's saying that thing, even if the statement is exactly the same, I may believe to it or not, depending where it's coming from, in which context. So I think that's my piece of answer to the difficult question. It's not just the statement and whether it is believable or not, but it's really a lot of this contextual information around it that makes us believe or not. And it's really a question of whether we trust or not the source of the information. And that's where the AI we build for this problem should be looking at. Right? It's really a question of building trust with the users rather than spitting out labels and removing content and making decisions for people. It's really about building a trust relationship that can allow users to then be on board with the decision that that's not trustworthy information.
Yeah, so there was a really good book I read recently called The New Conspiracism. And it says that there have been conspiracy theories around for as long as there have been human societies. But until relatively recently, what conspiracy theories would do is take little snippets of the facts and then weave them together in this narrative that didn't make sense to the rest of us, but made sense to the conspiracy theorists, that they take a little bit of fact from here and a bit of fact from there and a bit of fact from there, and they weave it together. And the argument in this book, written by two professors, one from Harvard and one from Stanford, is that what distinguishes the new conspiracism today is that it's not necessarily connected to facts at all. That instead it's based on the digital age. It's like, I saw it on Facebook, that's enough. And so the new conspiracism takes just complete fabrications, like Obama's birth certificate, right? The fabrication that Barack Obama wasn't born in the United States. He released his birth certificate publicly to prove that that was wrong, and it made very little, to my knowledge, very little difference to the conspiracy theory that remained right throughout his presidency that he wasn't born in the US, which of course would have prohibited him from even running for the presidency. So the new conspiracism, I don't know what makes something believable, as opposed, I assume that there's a huge amount of psychology research going on into which ones go viral, which conspiracy theories go viral. There's a lot to do with the state of global politics. Frankly, I think there's a lot to do with the pandemic and the way in which the pandemic has been handled. So the pandemic has put people on edge. It's made people fearful and anxious for a very long, a prolonged period of time. It's made people uncertain about the future. And in that context, I think they're more likely to believe things that somehow shore up a sense of them having a coherent picture on a situation that is resistant to us having a coherent picture. So I think the fact that we've had a pandemic has actually dovetailed with things that were happening in global politics already before the pandemic, such as the election of President Donald Trump, for example. So I don't know which ones get picked up over others, or why some get picked up over others, but I do think that there's something in this argument that new conspiracism differs from conspiracy theories in the old days, which is another way of talking about misinformation and disinformation, insofar as it's not necessarily connected to any facts at all. And that's scary.
I've got a question from Martin. And I think this one just really flows well in the context of the news, Elon Musk trying to buy Twitter and talking about how it's the public square or the town square. How can we balance responding to misinformation with free speech principles? And I guess there can be a technical component perhaps to these AI algorithms, as well as social component.
So even though this is very unrealistic, in the end, I think that these large global corporations are going to have to break down into smaller entities. I can't see any other way that we could get the local responsiveness that's required. Yes, we can help with AI, and yes, we need human moderators involved, but I think that in the end, we're going to have to break them down into smaller entities to make them manageable. I think the analogy between the sites like Twitter and Facebook and a town square is a very poor analogy. I know Elon Musk claimed that Twitter, of course, is like a town square. And in fact, there was a very important US Supreme Court judgment, the Packingham judgment, which said that the internet, not Twitter, but the internet more broadly, is the contemporary town square insofar as we all engage in a huge amount of our political communication, especially on the internet, and that is true. But in many ways, those individual platforms, they're not analogous to a town square at all. They're much more analogous to a private business, to a private corporation, in which the bosses regulate the behaviour of their employees quite significantly. They have a lot of power to decide what their employees can and can't do. And they don't necessarily exercise that power in a way that is overt to scrutiny. So in many ways, I don't like the public square analogy with a specific platform as opposed to with the internet as a whole at all. I don't think that's very useful. So,
anything you want to add?
Yeah, I can add something. So my personal opinion is that we could have algorithms detecting. Let's make the hypothesis that we do have algorithms detecting harmful content on these platforms. So now the question is what we do with this algorithmic decision. One thing is to remove content which is detected as such from the platform, but this is basically an approach which follows censorship. We decide this. Someone decides, and typically will be a white male in California, deciding that this content is harmful and therefore it's censored from the platform. The other approach I see possible is really this idea of increasing transparency and bringing, giving power to the users in making a decision by themselves. So, as we said, rather than having an AI making a decision, this content not good out, and we never get to see it because an AI has decided so. I don't really want that. I don't want an algorithm to decide what I will never see, which is the current state of affairs, right? The algorithm is deciding what I see, but most importantly, it's deciding what I don't see. And that's a bit of an issue. So the other approach I think it's a bit better is, as I said, increasing transparency. So giving more information to the users about what's going on. What as the user, what are the interests of this user who posted this claim, what they are, what are conflict of interest, why are they saying this, who is the person saying this, and who are the friends of the person saying this. So the more information we surface to users consuming information and misinformation, the more empowered they will be to make the call of not trusting this misinformation, really saying, no, okay, I understand why they are saying this, so it's not true. And I know why it's not true, because they have a benefit by saying that, and they have a benefit by me believing to that. So if we reach that point, then we really build this information literacy in the public, which allows them to not rely on the platform, on the regulator, on the algorithm to make the calls for them, and they are able to make that call.
And there's a role for AI in that, and in surfacing that information.
I think it's critical. We need the algorithms to it's the tools that the user needs to use to have the right information to make the judgment. In my opinion, it's the user who needs to make the judgment rather than the algorithm, but the algorithm is the one finding the right information for them to consume and be aware of what's happening.
Thank you. That dovetails perfectly with a question that we got from Angus. If you're with us, Angus, should the Australian government run an education campaign on identifying and the threats of misinformation? Maybe we'll just touch on if there's anything to add there, and then we'll get a couple of live questions.
Well, the answer is yes, absolutely they should. It might be a little bit difficult for them to do that in the current context, given the amount of fact checking that's going on about election claims on every side, but certainly conversations of a new carbon tax and so on and so on. So, yeah, I think it'd be great. We do have a new e-safety commissioner, which does a lot of awareness raising within, obviously, its terms of reference. And there is a new voluntary code on disinformation amongst the digital industry in Australia. So there are quite a lot of attempts policy-wise to get at this problem. But yeah, I think it'd be great to run a bit of an education campaign about concrete steps that you as an individual user can take to minimise the risk that you will unknowingly forward or reproduce misinformation that could result in harm that you don't want to commit, you don't want to incur.
It occurs to me that it could be supported with the tools that you were.
I think we need the tools. I think we need the technology. Think of it, when we buy a device, we don't read the manual like we used to, right? The instructions, how it works. We are now used to a world in which we consume technology and we don't need to learn. So learning how to, I think it's going to be tricky to convince people they need to learn. We need the tools. We need to build the tools and the technology that will be natural for people to learn through time, but they need to be supported by tools to do that.
We have a few minutes to open it up if anyone has a question about that they want to jump in with, or if looks like we have a question here. From David, disinformation has always been an integral component of deception operations in warfare. Are state-sponsored disinformation campaigns simply an extension of statecraft and the achievement of geopolitical objectives in the cyber realm? Is there a place for disinformation capabilities in our national cyber arsenal?
I think that possibly the answer to that depends on the threat that you're facing. So, and it has to be, of course, a balanced and proportionate assessment of the threat. So as a general rule, no, I wouldn't see that as part of ordinary everyday political activities. But there's a colleague of mine in the School of Political Science did a series on ABC Radio, a podcast series called History Listen. And she talked about particular moments in history that were really interesting and that changed the course of the world. And one of them was that, and I apologise if I haven't got all the details right, but in World War II, the Allies got the body of somebody who had died and they dressed him in a uniform and they put in his pocket fake orders for something, for some apparent offensive on the European continent. And then they dumped this body at sea in the hope that the Germans would find this body, assume it was, and it was a captain's uniform, it was a senior uniform, find this encoded secret message and think that they had intercepted a set of orders for the Allies to mount an offensive on this front instead of on this front. And it worked. So clearly there are moments in political strategizing critical moments when there is scope for the appropriate use of misinformation or even disinformation. But obviously that was a war, right? That was a really perilous situation. And in ordinary everyday transactions, trust is so important. Being able to go to international meetings with other heads of states where what you say is considered to be the truth, as we saw, for example, in the submarines issue, where we were simultaneously telling the French that we were moving ahead with that contract while simultaneously talking to the UK about a completely different contract and knowing we were going to drop the French one. So that really undermined our credibility on the international stage because we were perceived to be using misinformation deliberately in order to kind of gain as a nation and to undermine our relations with other nations. So it has to be used very, very carefully. The deliberate use of either misinformation or disinformation would never be completely off the table for any country, but should not be part of the daily routine of politics. And indeed, that's one of the problems of what's happened in the US over the past 5 years, or in the period certainly under Trump's presidency, was that misinformation was just a daily part of the presidency. And that absolutely thoroughly undermined confidence in politics, not just in that presidency or that administration, but in the ability of political institutions to respond to social issues. And of course, we're seeing that now play out in the pandemic and the fact that they can't even get a mask mandate through the US Supreme Court. So to try and keep kids safe in schools. So yes, if misinformation is used as an ordinary, everyday part of statecraft, it undermines democratic institutions and it undermines confidence in the ability of political leaders to solve complex problems. So as a general rule, it shouldn't be used. But in exceptional circumstances where there's sufficient threat and where it's being used for a specific narrow purpose, it is a tool of statecraft.
And just thinking of that political lens, is sitting here in Australia, I'm also wondering about the role of AI in the misinformation and information around the election campaign. And I'm thinking especially that you might have something to say around that, in terms of AI tools and misinformation or information around our current election.
Is the question there is currently misinformation in the campaign? I think the answer is yes.
And the AI tools to sort of look at that.
And we do have the AI tools to classify these claims as being truthful or not. So it is technologically possible to run these AI models through claims, and we are tracking the advertisement messages that the political parties are doing and then classifying them. We decided not to disclose publicly this information, especially during the campaigns, as it could interfere. But yeah, it is possible. It could be analyzed and measured, like how much this party is making false claims and how much this other party is making false claims. They are already doing it by themselves, right? If you look at, they are all blaming each other of telling lies. That's the hottest topic in the campaign currently. Each party is telling the other, "Oh, you are telling lies," and you are telling lies. So I think it's happening, and AI can help in measuring and quantifying that.
Excellent. Any final questions from the room? We've got one, yes, over here, Shazia.
So thank you so much for such a enlightening discussion. Really, Catherine, value your insight into it. I know where Gianluca is coming forward. Always a great pleasure to hear. So I want to go back to the previous discussion around literacy. And I guess we are in the education business, so how can we not support that? And I'm thinking, there's an underlying assumption that literacy and education will help people do the right thing, or at least, equip them. And, I want to bring in the economic drivers into the conversation. So these are more intrinsic drivers, right? So if you're better educated, if you know this is the wrong thing to do, then, we're assuming that will help mitigate. There is this, I think it's a book or at least a series of articles out of one of the universities in the East Coast on surveillance capitalism. And I am wondering if you perhaps have already, if that's on your radar, but it talks about the commercial agenda of these platform companies, which are in conflict because the intensity of the interaction of individuals gives them the fuel with which they can do targeted marketing. And that's where their commercial gains are. So there is a bit of a conflict there. So I'm just wondering about, your thoughts on the economic side of things and whether alongside literacy, there need to be different economic imperatives?
Well, I guess the short answer would be yes, but again, I don't know how you do that. I don't know how you get the platforms, because they're very, very profitable industries. And you know, and it's so targeted. The algorithms are so good at, like we all know, if you're looking for, I don't know, a new bed, and you do some research on beds, and then for the next 2 weeks, you're just bombarded with ads for beds. And each individual person is bombarded with different content based on their knowledge of what you've been doing. And so, yes, the surveillance is, and we all give it away. We give that surveillance away every time we use one of these devices. And hardly anybody reads the terms of service before they click I agree, because we all want to be online. And so they have enormous amounts of data. There are increasing regulatory moves around privacy to try and restrict their ability to on-sell that data and require them to use the data in appropriate ways, which is good. But yes, it's ultimately they're just extraordinarily economically successful businesses. And much of the regulation that we're talking about, much of the requirement to build it differently, to learn how to build it differently, to take into account the unintended consequences of their algorithms, much of that is either going to cost them money in resources and development, or it's going to affect how much money they can make from the day-to-day operation of their platform. And that's the opposite. My understanding is one of the reasons that Elon Musk was even looking at Twitter is that prior to Elon Musk, the CEO, came in with a mandate. You need to increase the number of users by X million, and you need to increase the revenue by Y million. And he wasn't reaching the targets. He had increased the number of Twitter users by, I think, 1 million or 4 million, but that wasn't considered to be enough. So these business imperatives are very, very, very strong, and they seem to be prepared. I don't know a lot about how they operate internally, but they seem to be prepared to really put that business model first. So again, these things are in very strong tension. The desire for regulation, the desire for a minimisation of harm, the desire for them to take more time in how they build their algorithms versus that economic imperative and their accountability, I guess, in the first instance to shareholders rather than anyone else. I'd like it to be inverted, so their accountability was to users first and foremost. I don't know how you do that.
I think it could be a win-win in a way. So the value for the platform is not just how many users, but different users are different and they bring different value to the platform. For example, on Facebook, they differentiate between users who share news and external links with users who share personal stories. And those who share personal stories are much more valuable to the platform in a commercial point of view. And between those who share personal stories, they differentiate between those who share positive stories like successes and job promotions, and those who share negative stories and family losses. And those are the most valuable commercially for the platform. And they really, there are very few of those, the minority, and they really see those users, those who really trust the platform, with giving to the platform the most valuable information they have. So that's what they're trying everyone to convert to. It's not about having 2 billions, but it's having about 2 billions of people who tell you, my puppy was dying yesterday. So what the platform is trying to do is building a trust relationship with the user, so that the user is trusting the platform enough to share sensitive information. And the trust is what we said earlier we need, right? We need the platform to build a trust relationship by not showing misinformation, but by not inducing and misleading the users and giving them traps into things which are not true and potentially harmful. So that's not what the platform wants. We are on the same line. I think the platforms are happy and they have a commercial value not to mislead users because they want users to trust the platform. So it could be a win-win, but it's a very tricky game.
Well, I think that brings us to the close. Thank you. That was a fantastic discussion, and I mean, touching on everything from how complicated it is to identify misinformation to and identify it to the business model. Thank you very much. I just really want to thank you both for taking the time to share with us. And we could all please feel free to check in with the UQ AI Collaboratory website to follow up on upcoming events. Thanks very much.